My name is Harper Mitchell, and I'm 26 years old. Right now, I'm lying in a hospital bed, staring at my phone screen through tears, watching my family celebrate my brother while I'm alone and terrified. 3 fractured ribs, a shattered femur, internal bleeding that needs emergency surgery within hours. My hands won't stop shaking as I dial Mom for the 7th time. Voicemail. Again. I try, Dad. Nothing. Then I see the family group chat exploding with photos of champagne toasts and graduation caps. They're at Ethan's party. My golden child brother's big day. And I'm here, possibly dying, completely invisible to the people who are supposed to love me most. Before we dive into what happened next, drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from. If you've ever felt invisible in your own family, hit that like button because this story is going to take you on a journey you won't believe. Subscribe and turn on notifications because you'll want to hear how this ends. Trust me, what my family did next will shock you. Now, let me take you back to how I got here. The fluorescent hospital lights buzzed overhead as I lay there, trying to make sense of how my life had led to this moment of complete abandonment. The nurse had just adjusted my IV, and the morphine was making everything feel distant and surreal, but the pain in my chest wasn't just from the fractured ribs. It was the kind of pain I'd been carrying my whole life. The kind that comes from always being second best in your own family. Growing up as the eldest child in the Mitchell household meant I learned early that love was conditional, and the conditions were never in my favor. Ethan came along 3 years after me, and from the moment he drew his first breath, the entire axis of our family shifted toward him like he was the sun, and I was some forgotten moon orbiting in the darkness. I remember being 12 years old, standing in the hallway outside my bedroom, watching my parents convert what had been the playroom into this massive, beautiful space for Ethan. He got the bedroom with the bay windows, the walk-in closet, the private bathroom with the good water pressure. Meanwhile, I stayed in the smallest bedroom at the end of the hall, the one where the radiator clanked all night in winter and the air conditioning barely reached in summer. When I asked why Ethan needed such a big room, Dad just patted my head and said something about me being the responsible one who didn't need all that space. Even then, at 12, I understood what he really meant. I didn't matter enough to warrant the effort. Every birthday, every Christmas, every milestone became this exercise in swallowing disappointment while watching Ethan unwrap the latest iPhone, the newest gaming console, the designer sneakers that cost more than my entire wardrobe. I got practical things like socks and school supplies, and I was expected to be grateful for it. The pattern continued through high school with a precision that would have been impressive if it wasn't so devastating. I made honor roll every single semester for 4 years straight, maintaining a grade point average that got me into the National Honor Society. The ceremony was on a Tuesday evening in May, and I had reminded my parents about it for 3 weeks straight. I even left a note on the refrigerator that morning before school. But when I stood on that stage accepting my certificate, scanning the audience for familiar faces, all I saw were strangers and the parents of my classmates. Mine were at Ethan's Little League game, watching him sit on the bench for most of it because he wasn't even that good at baseball. When I got home that night, Mom was in the kitchen making Ethan's favorite cookies because his team had lost. She glanced at my certificate and said, "Oh, that's nice, honey," before turning back to the oven. That was it. No apology for missing it. No acknowledgement that maybe, just maybe, I had deserved their presence for once. Turning 16 should have been exciting. That magical age when most teenagers start dreaming about the freedom of having their own car. I had been saving money since I was 14, working weekend shifts at the local grocery store, babysitting every Friday night, tutoring kids in math after school. I saved $2,300 over those 2 years, every penny earned through my own sweat and sacrifice. I bought myself a used Honda Civic with a dented bumper and a temperamental transmission, and I was so proud of that car because it represented something I had accomplished entirely on my own. 6 months later, Ethan turned 16, and our parents surprised him with a brand new SUV in the driveway, complete with a giant red bow like something out of a commercial. He hadn't worked a single day in his life. He hadn't saved a single dollar. But there it was, $40,000 worth of vehicle just handed to him because he smiled and asked for it. College was supposed to be my escape, my chance to build a life where effort actually mattered. I applied to 12 universities and got accepted to 10 of them, including 2 Ivy League schools. I was so excited to show my parents the acceptance letters, convinced that surely this would make them proud. Dad looked at the financial aid packages and shook his head, saying we couldn't afford the out-of-pocket expenses even with scholarships. I didn't understand at the time because I knew my grandmother had set up college funds for both Ethan and me before she passed away when I was 8. Dad assured me that money had been used for necessary family expenses over the years, and there was nothing left. So I went to the state university, took out massive student loans, and worked 2 jobs throughout all 4 years to pay for textbooks, rent, and food. I barely slept. I barely had a social life. But I graduated with honors and a degree in marketing, and I did it entirely on my own, while my parents sent Ethan care packages every week filled with his favorite snacks and money for pizza. Even after college, even after I moved into my own apartment and started building my career, I kept trying. I kept showing up to family dinners where the conversation centered entirely on Ethan's job prospects and Ethan's new apartment and Ethan's dating life. I kept calling every Sunday like a good daughter. I kept sending thoughtful birthday gifts and helping Mom with her computer problems and offering to do anything that might earn me a scrap of the love they poured so effortlessly onto my brother. I told myself that maybe when Ethan was older, when he didn't need them as much, they would finally see me, finally appreciate the daughter who had been there all along, steady and reliable and desperate for their attention. The accident happened on a Wednesday afternoon in late May. I had taken the day off work specifically to attend Ethan's college graduation ceremony because Mom had called me 3 times that week to remind me not to be late and definitely not to embarrass the family by missing such an important occasion. The ceremony was at 2 in the afternoon, and I was running behind because I had stayed late at the office the night before finishing a presentation for a client. I was driving too fast, I'll admit that, trying to make up time because I knew Mom would never forgive me if I arrived after the ceremony started. The intersection was busy, one of those confusing 5-way stops where nobody really knows who has the right of way. I had just accelerated through when the drunk driver ran the red light going at least 60 miles per hour. The sound of the impact is something I'll never forget. This horrible crunching screech of metal tearing through metal, glass exploding into a million pieces that rained down like violent snow. The other car hit my passenger side door, and the force of it sent my car spinning across the intersection like a toy. My head slammed against something. The airbag deployed in a blast of chemical smoke, and then everything was pain. Sharp, screaming pain in my ribs where the seatbelt had locked across my chest. Unbearable pain in my right leg that made me look down and immediately wish I hadn't, because it was bent at an angle that legs are definitely not supposed to bend. The smell of gasoline was overwhelming, and somewhere through the ringing in my ears, I heard people shouting. The drunk driver had fled the scene on foot, just abandoned his destroyed vehicle and ran, leaving me trapped in my crumpled car, wondering if I was going to die at 26 years old on my way to celebrate my brother. The paramedics arrived within minutes, and I remember fragments of their conversation as they worked to extract me from the wreckage, something about the jaws of life and possible internal injuries, and needing to transport immediately. The ride to the hospital was a blur of sirens and pain medication that didn't quite touch the agony radiating through my entire body. They rushed me through emergency, and I remember a doctor with kind eyes telling me I was lucky to be alive. Lucky. That word felt like a joke as they wheeled me into a trauma bay, and a team of medical professionals swarmed around me, cutting off my clothes, inserting more IVs, taking x-rays and scans. Through it all, the only thought in my mind was that I needed to call my parents. They needed to know what happened. They needed to come. I asked a nurse for my phone, and she retrieved it from the plastic bag containing my personal belongings. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely unlock the screen, and my vision kept swimming in and out of focus. But I managed to pull up Mom's contact and hit call. It rang 4 times before going to voicemail. I tried again immediately. Same result. I called Dad next, my heart pounding against my fractured ribs, each beat sending fresh waves of pain through my chest. Voicemail again. This had to be a mistake. Maybe they were in the ceremony. Maybe their phones were on silent. I sent a text to our family group chat, the one where Mom sent daily updates and photos and reminders about upcoming events. I typed out with trembling fingers, "I'm in the hospital. Please come. It's serious." I watched the message deliver, watched it change to read almost immediately. And then, nothing. The nurse, whose badge identified her as Keisha, noticed my distress and asked gently if there was anyone she should call. I told her my parents should be here any minute. They must just be finishing up at my brother's graduation. But as the minutes stretched into an hour, and the hour stretched into 2, Keisha's expression grew more concerned. She brought me ice chips and adjusted my position to ease the pressure on my ribs, and she didn't say anything about the tears streaming down my face that had nothing to do with physical pain. I kept checking my phone obsessively, scrolling through the family group chat where new messages were popping up constantly. Mom had posted a photo of Ethan in his cap and gown with the caption, "My brilliant boy." Dad had shared a picture of the fancy restaurant where they were having the celebration dinner. Ethan had posted a selfie with his friends, all of them holding champagne flutes and grinning. I called 7 more times. Mom's phone, Dad's phone, the house landline that nobody ever answered, but I tried anyway. Each call went to voicemail or rang endlessly. I sent more texts. "Please, I'm scared. I need surgery. Please come." Read receipts showed they had seen every single message. And still, nothing. The doctor returned, this time with a more serious expression, and explained that I had 3 fractured ribs on my right side. My femur was shattered in 2 places and would require surgery to insert metal rods and pins, and they had detected internal bleeding that needed to be addressed immediately. Surgery needed to happen within the next few hours, and because of the anesthesia and the recovery process, they needed an emergency contact present to sign consent forms and make medical decisions if complications arose. I was over 18, legally an adult, but hospital policy and medical best practices meant they wanted family there. I had to explain to this kind doctor that my family was at my brother's graduation party and apparently couldn't be bothered to respond to my messages. The shame of saying those words out loud, of admitting that my own parents were ignoring my desperate pleas for help, felt worse than the physical injuries. Dr. Reyes, that was her name. Dr. Sophia Reyes looked at me with such compassion that it made me cry harder. She told me she would give me some time to reach someone, anyone who could come and be with me, and she squeezed my hand before leaving to check on other patients. That's when I called Sloane, my roommate, and the person who had become my closest friend over the past 3 years. I told her what happened, and I will never forget the fury in her voice when she said, "Where the hell is your family?" She was at the hospital within 30 minutes, bursting through the doors of my room like an avenging angel, her face flushed from running through the parking lot. She held my hand and stroked my hair and told me everything was going to be okay, but I could see in her eyes that she was horrified by my injuries, and even more horrified that I was essentially alone. Sloane offered to stay, to be there for the surgery, but the hospital explained she couldn't sign the legal documents since she wasn't family. The nurse suggested I try other relatives, and I realized I hadn't even thought to call my Aunt Patricia, my dad's older sister who lived about 45 minutes away. Aunt Patricia answered on the second ring, and when I told her what happened, when I explained through sobs that Mom and Dad weren't coming, there was a moment of shocked silence before she said words I'll never forget. "I'm leaving right now, sweetheart. I'll be there in 30 minutes. And your father is going to answer to me for this." She was true to her word, arriving breathless and frantic, immediately pulling me into as gentle a hug as she could manage given my injuries. Patricia had always been different from the rest of the family, less caught up in the strange dynamic that elevated Ethan to golden child status. She had questioned my parents' treatment of me before, but they had dismissed her concerns as interference. Now, standing in my hospital room, seeing the evidence of the accident and my abandonment, her face transformed from worry to pure rage. Patricia pulled out her phone and called my father right there in the room, putting it on speaker so I could hear. Dad answered with an annoyed, "Patricia, what is it? We're in the middle of Ethan's celebration dinner." Aunt Patricia's voice was ice as she said, "Your daughter is in the hospital. She was in a severe car accident. She has multiple fractures and internal bleeding and needs emergency surgery. She's been trying to reach you for hours." There was a pause, and then Dad had the audacity to say, "Harper's always been dramatic. She probably has a cold and wants attention on Ethan's big day. Tell her we'll call tomorrow." The line went dead. He hung up on his own sister while his daughter lay broken in a hospital bed. Aunt Patricia stared at her phone in disbelief, and then she looked at me with tears in her eyes and said, "I am so sorry, Harper. I knew they were neglectful, but this is unconscionable." Dr. Reyes returned then, and with Aunt Patricia present to sign the necessary forms, they could proceed with surgery. As the anesthesiologist explained the procedure and the nurses prepped me for the operating room, I kept thinking about that family group chat, about the photos of smiling faces and celebration, about how I had been rushing to be part of that celebration when the accident happened. I had been trying so hard to be a good daughter, a good sister, and this was where it got me. Alone except for the relatives who actually cared. Invisible to the people who were supposed to love me unconditionally. The last thing I remember before the anesthesia pulled me under was Aunt Patricia's face hovering above me, her hand gripping mine, and her voice promising that she would be right there when I woke up. Then everything went dark, and I was swallowed by a dreamless void that was almost peaceful compared to the emotional agony of the past few hours. The surgery took 4 hours, according to the clock, when I finally clawed my way back to consciousness. Everything felt wrong and distant, my body a collection of disconnected parts that all screamed in different frequencies of pain. My leg was encased in bandages and elevated, metal rods now running through my shattered femur like some kind of internal scaffolding holding the pieces of me together. Aunt Patricia was there, exactly as she promised, slumped in the uncomfortable vinyl chair beside my bed. She had clearly been crying, her eyes red and swollen, and she looked exhausted in a way that suggested she hadn't slept at all during my surgery. When she noticed I was awake, she straightened immediately and reached for my hand, careful not to disturb the IV lines. "Hey, sweetheart, you're okay. The surgery went well. Dr. Reyes said everything went exactly as planned." Her voice was gentle, but I could hear the anger simmering underneath. I tried to ask about my parents, but my throat was too dry, the words coming out as a croak. Patricia helped me take small sips of water through a straw, and then she told me what I already knew deep down. "Your parents finally called back about an hour ago. They said they would come by tomorrow, after the graduation brunch." Tomorrow, after the brunch. Not immediately. Not dropping everything to be with their critically injured daughter. Tomorrow, after they had finished celebrating Ethan, after they had exhausted every moment of his special day. I started crying, and I couldn't stop, and the crying made my ribs hurt so badly that I thought I might pass out again. The pain medication they had given me made everything feel fuzzy and surreal, but it couldn't touch the ache in my chest that had nothing to do with fractures. A nurse came in to check my vitals, the same nurse from before, Keisha, and she saw me sobbing and immediately knew it wasn't about the physical pain. She didn't say anything, just adjusted my medication and gave Aunt Patricia a look that conveyed everything words couldn't. I drifted in and out of sleep for the rest of that night, always waking to find Aunt Patricia still there, keeping vigil like a guardian angel I didn't deserve but desperately needed. The next morning came too quickly and too slowly all at once. The sun streaming through the hospital window felt obscene, too bright and cheerful for how dark everything felt inside my heart. Nurses came and went, checking my incisions, managing my pain levels, bringing me food I couldn't stomach. And at 11 in the morning, a full 18 hours after the accident that nearly killed me, my parents finally arrived. Mom walked in wearing the same designer outfit she had worn to Ethan's party, her makeup perfect, her hair styled, looking like she was heading to brunch with friends rather than visiting her hospitalized daughter. Dad followed behind her, his attention already divided as he checked his phone. There was no rush to my bedside, no tears of relief that I had survived, no apologies for their absence. Instead, Mom looked around the hospital room with thinly veiled annoyance and said words that felt like a physical slap. "Harper, you really scared us. Why didn't you just call an Uber to the hospital instead of making this into a whole production?" I couldn't speak. My mouth opened, but no sound came out because what do you even say to something like that? How do you respond when your mother suggests you should have taken a rideshare service instead of an ambulance after being T-boned by a drunk driver? Aunt Patricia stood up from her chair, and I had never seen her look so furious. But before she could say anything, Dad interjected with his own contribution to this nightmare. "Honey, we have the contractors coming at 2 to look at Ethan's new apartment. We can't stay long. Not a question about my injuries. Not an expression of concern. Just a statement about their time limitations because, of course, Ethan's needs took priority even now." They hadn't brought flowers. They hadn't brought a card or a stuffed animal or any of the traditional tokens people bring to hospital rooms. They had brought nothing except their irritation at having their schedule disrupted. Mom sat in the chair Aunt Patricia had vacated, but she perched on the edge like she might bolt at any moment, and she launched into a complaint that made me question my entire reality. "You really ruined Ethan's graduation, you know. People kept asking where you were, and we had to make up excuses. It was mortifying to explain that you were in the hospital. It made the whole evening awkward." She said this like I had deliberately gotten into a car accident to spite her, like I had orchestrated my own near-death experience for the specific purpose of inconveniencing her at a party. I found my voice then, hoarse and broken. I almost died. The doctor said if the impact had been 2 inches to the left, it would have hit directly where I was sitting. I have metal rods in my leg now. I'm going to need months of physical therapy. I said these things, hoping for recognition, for some acknowledgement of the severity of what had happened. Instead, Dad waved his hand dismissively and said, "You're young, you'll heal." Meanwhile, Ethan is starting his career at Goldman Sachs next month. We need to focus on setting him up for success. This is a crucial time for him. The implication was clear. My broken body, my trauma, my recovery were all inconvenient distractions from what really mattered, which was Ethan's life and Ethan's future and Ethan's success. Mom added her own twist to the knife. "And honestly, Harper, if you had been more careful driving, this wouldn't have happened. You've always been careless." I stared at her, this woman who had given birth to me, who was supposed to protect me, and I realized she genuinely believed what she was saying. In her mind, I was at fault for being hit by a drunk driver. I was the problem for being injured. I was the inconvenience for requiring medical attention. 20 minutes, that's how long they stayed. 20 minutes of complaints and dismissals and thinly veiled accusations before Dad checked his watch and announced they needed to leave for their contractor appointment. Aunt Patricia walked them to the door, and I heard her voice low and furious in the hallway. "What is wrong with you? How can you treat your own daughter like this?" Mom's response was loud enough to carry back into my room. "Patricia, you don't understand. Harper has always been independent. She doesn't need us the way Ethan does. We're just being realistic about where our attention is most needed." They left, and I heard their footsteps retreating down the hospital corridor, and something inside me cracked in a way that had nothing to do with ribs or bones. Keisha, the nurse who had been caring for me, came in shortly after. She had clearly heard at least part of the exchange, and as she checked my IV, she said something that would stay with me forever. "Baby girl, that ain't love. That's abuse. Don't you forget it." The hospital kept me for 6 days, monitoring my recovery from surgery, managing my pain levels, teaching me how to navigate the world with a body that felt like it belonged to someone else. Physical therapists came daily, forcing me to do exercises that made me want to scream, but they were patient and encouraging in a way my own parents had never been. My parents visited one more time during those 6 days, and only because Aunt Patricia had called Dad and essentially shamed him into showing up. They stayed for 15 minutes, spent most of that time on their phones, and left without asking a single meaningful question about my prognosis or my needs. Ethan never visited, he never called. According to the family group chat that I had stopped checking because it hurt too much, he was busy moving into his new apartment and starting orientation at his new job. When Dr. Reyes finally cleared me for discharge, I faced a significant problem. I lived in a third-floor walk-up apartment with no elevator, and there was absolutely no way I could manage 3 flights of stairs on crutches with a leg that couldn't bear any weight. Sloane offered to let me stay with her, but her apartment building had the same issue. Aunt Patricia lived in a small 2-bedroom condo and offered immediately, but she also worked full-time as a teacher and couldn't provide the around-the-clock care I would need for at least the first few weeks, which left one option I desperately didn't want to take but felt I had no choice. My parents' house, the place I had grown up, had a first-floor guest room. When Aunt Patricia called to arrange it, Mom sighed heavily and said, "Fine, but this is temporary. She's 26 years old. She should have savings for situations like this." The first indication that moving home was a catastrophic mistake came the moment I arrived. Dad helped me out of Aunt Patricia's car, handed me the crutches, and then disappeared into his home office for a work call without another word. Mom showed me to the guest room, and I noticed immediately that my childhood bedroom, the small one at the end of the hall, was no longer mine. They had converted it into a home gym for Ethan, complete with expensive weight equipment and a wall-mounted television. My swimming trophies that used to line the shelf had been packed away somewhere. My books were gone. It was like I had never existed in that space at all. The guest room was the smallest room in the house, barely large enough for a twin bed and a dresser, with a window that looked out onto the neighbor's fence. Mom gestured vaguely at the room and said, "This will have to do. And Harper, I need you to understand this is temporary. You're 26, and you should have been better prepared for emergencies." The pain medication made me too tired to argue, so I just nodded and let Aunt Patricia help me settle in. Over the next few days, the reality of my situation became crushingly clear. My health insurance, which I paid for through my job, covered most of the hospital stay and surgery, but I was still facing nearly $12,000 in medical bills for things insurance classified as not medically necessary, like the specific type of pain medication I needed and some of the follow-up appointments with specialists. I had a little bit in savings, maybe $3,000, but that was supposed to be for emergencies like a car repair or if I lost my job. This was going to wipe me out financially and then some. I worked up the courage to ask my parents if they could help with the medical bills, just a loan that I would pay back once I returned to work. Dad was in the kitchen making coffee when I brought it up, and he didn't even turn around. "Harper, we just put $20,000 down on Ethan's apartment deposit. Money doesn't grow on trees. You're going to have to figure this out yourself like an adult." Meanwhile, Ethan was living in a luxury 1-bedroom apartment in the downtown area, the kind of place with a doorman and a rooftop terrace and monthly rent that exceeded my entire paycheck. My parents had furnished it completely, from the designer couch to the king-sized bed to the artwork on the walls. They had even bought him a full set of business suits for his new job. But they couldn't spare a single dollar to help me with medical bills from an accident I hadn't caused. Physical therapy appointments started 2 weeks after discharge, 3 times a week at a facility 45 minutes away. The appointments were crucial for my recovery. The difference between regaining full mobility and having permanent limitations. I asked Mom if she could drive me since I obviously couldn't drive myself with a shattered femur and pain medication that made operating a vehicle illegal and dangerous. She looked at me like I had asked her to donate a kidney. "Harper, I have my book club on Tuesdays and Thursdays, and my yoga class on Wednesdays and Fridays. I can't just rearrange my entire schedule." I pointed out that my appointments were at 9 in the morning and would only take an hour, including drive time. She said she needed her mornings for her meditation routine and couldn't be stressed by hospital environments. Sloane ended up leaving work early 3 times a week to drive me, sacrificing her own job security and dealing with an increasingly annoyed boss because my own mother couldn't be bothered. I felt like such a burden, such an imposition on everyone except the people who should have been helping. The physical therapy itself was brutal. forcing me to move my leg in ways that sent lightning bolts of agony through my entire body. But the therapist said pain was part of the healing process. Progress was slow and frustrating, but I was determined to recover fully, to not let this accident define the rest of my life. 3 weeks into my stay at my parents' house, my pain medication ran out. I had one refill left on the prescription, and I needed someone to pick it up from the pharmacy because I still couldn't drive. I asked Dad on a Monday morning when he was reading the newspaper at the kitchen table. He nodded absently and said he would get it that afternoon. Afternoon came and went. Evening came and went. I asked again Tuesday morning. He said he had forgotten but would definitely get it today. Tuesday passed. Wednesday passed. By Thursday morning, I was in so much pain I could barely move, sweating and shaking from the combination of physical agony and withdrawal symptoms from the opioid pain medication. I was crying in the guest room when Aunt Patricia called to check on me, and when I told her about the medication situation, she was at the pharmacy within an hour. She handed me the pill bottle with hands that trembled with rage, and then she went to find Dad, who was in his office on a video conference call. I heard her voice through the wall, low and furious, telling him exactly what she thought of a man who would let his daughter suffer for 3 days because he couldn't be bothered to make a 10-minute stop at a pharmacy. Dad's response, which I also heard, was defensive and dismissive. She's fine. She's being dramatic about the pain. People recover from broken bones all the time without all this fuss. This was the same man who had taken Ethan to the emergency room last year because he had a splinter and was worried about infection. The breaking point came on a random Tuesday evening, 4 weeks into my recovery. I was lying in the guest room, trying to do the exercises the physical therapist had assigned for homework, when I heard laughter coming from the living room. Ethan's voice, the first time I had heard it since before the accident, mixed with my parents' voices in a warm, joyful sound that had never been directed at me. I struggled onto my crutches and made my way slowly down the hallway. The dining room table was set with Mom's good china, candles lit, an elaborate meal spread across the surface. Roasted chicken, garlic mashed potatoes, green beans, almondine, fresh bread, a chocolate cake on the sideboard. Mom's specialty meal, the one she only made for special occasions. All 4 chairs were occupied. Mom, Dad, Ethan, and a 4th person I didn't recognize, probably one of Ethan's colleagues. There was no 5th chair. There was no place setting for me. I stood in the doorway on my crutches, and Mom looked up with an expression of surprise. "Oh, Harper. I didn't know you'd be joining us." This was supposed to be a special family dinner for Ethan's first week at his new job. We only made enough for 4. The words hit me like another car crash. Family dinner. I wasn't included in the concept of family. I was just the broken thing taking up space in the guest room, not worthy of a place at the table or advance notice that dinner was even happening. Ethan had the decency to look uncomfortable, shifting in his seat, but he didn't offer to give up his spot. He didn't suggest they set another place. He just sat there in his expensive suit, eating Mom's special meal, being celebrated for simply existing while I was treated like an unwanted ghost. 5 weeks into my recovery, I was starting to go stir-crazy. The 4 walls of that tiny guest room felt like a prison, and even though I was getting better at navigating on crutches, I was still largely confined to the house. My job had been understanding at first, but I had exhausted my sick leave and couldn't return to the office yet, so I was trying to work remotely when the pain and medication allowed. It was a random Thursday afternoon when I overheard the conversation that changed everything. I had fallen asleep on the couch in the living room, hidden by the high back of the furniture, and I woke up to Mom's voice on the phone in the kitchen. "I know it sounds harsh, Victoria, but Harper has always been independent. If we baby her now, she'll never learn to stand on her own 2 feet. There was a pause while the person on the other end, Victoria, who I assumed was Mom's best friend from her garden club, responded. Then Mom continued, "Besides, Ethan needs us more right now. Has starting his career, and this is such a crucial time. Harper will be fine, she always is. She's tough, and he's sensitive. We have to allocate our resources where they're most needed." Another pause. No, we're not paying for any of her medical bills. She has insurance. And she's an adult. She needs to learn financial responsibility. Meanwhile, Ethan needs help with his apartment and his wardrobe and networking. That's where our money should go. I lay there on the couch, barely breathing, listening to my mother discuss me like I was a business investment with poor returns. The casual cruelty of it, the calculated nature of the neglect, was somehow worse than if it had been thoughtless. This was intentional. This was a choice they made and continued to make, justified by some twisted logic that one child deserved everything and the other deserved nothing. I waited until Mom finished her call and went upstairs before I carefully maneuvered off the couch and back to the guest room. My hands were shaking, but not from physical pain this time. From rage and hurt and a growing realization that I needed to understand the full extent of how deep this betrayal went. 2 days later, the opportunity came. Dad had left his laptop open on the kitchen table while he took a phone call in the backyard. I knew I was invading his privacy, knew I was crossing a line, but something compelled me to look at the screen. It was his email, already open to his inbox. I saw a subject line from his financial advisor dated 3 months ago and clicked on it without thinking. What I found made my stomach drop. The email chain was discussing trust fund disbursements and long-term investment strategies. There, in clinical financial language, was documentation of something that shattered whatever remained of my relationship with my parents. My grandmother, my father's mother who had died when I was 8 years old, had set up 2 separate college trust funds. One for me, one for Ethan. The funds were supposed to be equal, approximately $60,000 each, invested conservatively to grow until we each turned 18. According to these emails, my fund had been transferred entirely into Ethan's name when he was 15 years old, 3 years before he even applied to college. The financial advisor had raised concerns about the legality of this transfer, noting that the trust documents specifically named me as the sole beneficiary. Dad's response, preserved in the email thread, was chilling. Harper doesn't need to know about this. We're reallocating family resources where they'll have the most impact. Ethan has more potential for success, and we need to invest accordingly. My hands shook as I took photos of the email chain with my phone, screenshot after screenshot, making sure I captured every word of this betrayal. I kept scrolling through Dad's email, and I found more. So much more. There were emails about my grandmother's house, a beautiful old Victorian where she had lived until her death. According to her will, which I had never seen, that house was supposed to go to me, her namesake. Harper had been my grandmother's middle name, but somehow, my parents had gained control of the property and sold it 6 years ago. The proceeds, nearly $300,000, had gone into investments for Ethan's future and funding my parents' early retirement plans. There were documents attached to these emails, legal papers that I didn't fully understand but that looked suspiciously like forged signatures. I forwarded the entire email chain to my own email address and then deleted the sent message from Dad's account, hoping he wouldn't notice. My heart was pounding so hard I thought I might pass out, and my leg was throbbing from standing for so long, but I couldn't stop looking. Every email I found revealed another layer of calculated theft and betrayal. My parents had systematically stolen my inheritance and given it to Ethan, all while telling me there was no money for college, no help available, that I needed to be independent and responsible. They had lied for years, letting me struggle and suffer under crushing student loan debt while they funneled resources meant for me toward their golden child. I printed everything at the library the next day when Sloan drove me to my physical therapy appointment. I called Aunt Patricia from the parking lot and asked her to meet me at a coffee shop. When she arrived, I spread the documents across the table between us, and I watched her face transform from confusion to horror to absolute fury as she read through the evidence. "This is fraud," she said finally, her voice shaking. "Harper, your parents committed financial fraud. They forged documents and stole your inheritance. This is criminal." I had suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed made everything real in a way that was almost too overwhelming to process. Aunt Patricia immediately said we needed to get a lawyer, but I was in no position to afford legal representation. I had medical bills I couldn't pay, no job income, and I was living in the house of the people who had robbed me. I felt trapped in every possible way, physically unable to leave, financially unable to fight back, emotionally devastated by the scope of their betrayal. Patricia told me not to worry about the cost, that she would figure something out, that we couldn't let them get away with this. But before I could even begin to process the legal implications, the third attack came. The bill arrived at the house in a large manila envelope addressed to me, forwarded from my apartment. It was from the hospital billing department, and it contained an itemized statement of charges not covered by insurance. $8,417. I had known there would be costs, but seeing the actual number in print made it real in a devastating way. I called the hospital's financial services office to set up a payment plan. And that's when I discovered another problem. According to their system, I didn't qualify for their financial assistance programs or their low-income payment plans because my income level, when combined with my parents' income, exceeded the threshold. When I explained that I didn't live with my parents and they didn't support me financially, the representative said that according to the most recent tax returns on file, I was claimed as a dependent. I hung up the phone and immediately pulled up my own tax records. I hadn't been claimed as a dependent since I was 17 years old and still in high school. I had filed my own taxes every year since turning 18, always as an independent adult. But when I requested copies of my parents' tax returns through the IRS, the truth emerged. For the past 3 years, they had claimed me as a dependent even though I hadn't lived with them and received no financial support. This was tax fraud, and it had consequences beyond just their tax bill. It disqualified me from financial assistance programs, affected my eligibility for certain benefits, and created a paper trail that made it look like they were supporting me when the opposite was true. When I confronted Dad about the tax fraud that evening, I expected denial or at least some show of shame. Instead, he looked at me with cold indifference and said, "We're helping you with housing right now, aren't we? The least you can do is help us with tax benefits. It's called being part of a family, Harper." Mom was standing in the doorway, and she added her own contribution to this nightmare. "Don't be so ungrateful. Do you know how much it costs to feed you? We could have said no when you needed a place to recover. Instead, we opened our home. And this is how you repay us? By accusing us of fraud." The gaslighting was so complete, so confident, that for a moment I almost doubted my own reality. But then I remembered the emails, the evidence, the systematic years of theft and lies. 6 weeks post-accident, and I was finally mobile enough to use crutches instead of the walker. It felt like progress, but it was the smallest of victories in a situation that kept getting worse. I received an email from my job, carefully worded and apologetic, explaining that they had held my position as long as they could, but 6 weeks without me in the office was causing too many problems for the team. They were terminating my employment effective immediately, with 2 weeks of severance pay and continued health insurance through the end of the month. After that, I would need to find coverage through Cobra, which would cost more per month than I had ever paid in rent. I was now unemployed, injured, trapped in my parents' house, facing massive medical debt, and apparently the victim of years of systematic financial fraud. I applied for unemployment benefits, hoping that would at least provide some income while I recovered enough to job hunt. Denied. Because according to the fraudulent tax returns, I was a dependent and not eligible. I applied for disability benefits, thinking surely a shattered femur and ongoing recovery would qualify. Also denied, for the same reason. Every safety net I reached for had been cut away by my parents' lies, and I was falling with nothing to catch me. The darkness that had been hovering at the edges of my consciousness since the hospital finally swallowed me whole. I spent an entire day lying in the guest room, staring at the ceiling, thinking about how much easier it would be to just not exist anymore. No more pain, physical or emotional. No more struggling against a family that had never wanted me. No more being a burden to Sloan and Aunt Patricia. I picked up my phone and opened a new note, and I started typing what I intended to be a goodbye message. I'm sorry I couldn't be stronger. I'm sorry, I was always such a disappointment. Maybe everyone will be better off without me trying so hard and failing anyway. Before I could finish the message, my phone buzzed with an incoming text from an unknown number. Hi Harper. This is Miranda Chen, senior partner at Hartwell & Associates law firm. Your Aunt Patricia contacted me regarding your situation. I'd like to help, pro bono. Can we talk tomorrow? I stared at that message for a long time, reading it over and over, wondering if it was real or if the pain medication was making me hallucinate. I deleted my goodbye note and replied with a simple yes and my available times. Miranda responded immediately with a coffee shop address and a time for the next afternoon. I had a meeting with a lawyer. I had a potential way forward. For the first time in weeks, I felt something other than despair. The next day, Sloan drove me to the coffee shop, a quiet place with comfortable seating where I could manage my crutches without too much difficulty. Miranda was already there when we arrived, a woman in her early 40s with sharp eyes and an expensive suit, radiating competence and power. She stood to shake my hand, helped me settle into a chair with my leg elevated, and then got straight to business. Your Aunt Patricia gave me a preliminary overview of your situation, but I need to hear everything from you. Start from the beginning, and don't leave anything out. So I told her everything: the accident, the 18 hours of being ignored, the pattern of neglect that stretched back to childhood, the stolen inheritance, the forged documents, the tax fraud, the medical debt, the job loss. I showed her the screenshots of the emails, the copies of tax documents, the hospital bills, everything I had gathered. Miranda took notes on her tablet, her expression growing darker with each revelation. And when I finally finished, she sat back and looked at me with something like awe. Harper, what you're describing is a textbook case of financial exploitation and emotional abuse. The forged inheritance documents alone constitute felony fraud. The tax fraud is a federal crime. Claiming you as a dependent falsely is identity theft in its own category. We have multiple strong cases here. But I don't have money for a lawyer, I said, because that was the reality that overrode everything else. Miranda shook her head. Your Aunt Patricia has already paid my retainer, and frankly, once we win this case, and we will win, we'll recover costs from your parents' assets plus damages. They stole from you. We're going to take it back, with interest. She explained her strategy in terms I could understand. First, we needed to secure my immediate safety and independence, which meant getting me out of my parents' house as soon as physically possible. Second, we would pursue legal action for the fraud, both civil suits to recover the stolen money and criminal complaints to ensure consequences. Third, we would work on rebuilding my financial stability and credit. The plan was clear and actionable, and for the first time since the accident, I felt something like hope. But I was also terrified. Taking on my parents legally meant declaring war, meant accepting that this family was irreparably broken, meant giving up any last shred of hope that they might suddenly realize what they had done and apologize and change. Miranda saw the fear on my face and said something I needed to hear. Harper, they've already declared war on you. You've been fighting alone and unarmed your whole life. All we're doing is giving you weapons and allies. You deserve justice, and more importantly, you deserve to be free from them. We spent another hour going over details and timelines. Miranda said she would start with a formal legal letter, informing my parents that their fraudulent tax claims and theft of inheritance were known, and that legal action was imminent. This would be delivered via certified mail, creating a paper trail, and putting them on notice. She also said I needed to document everything happening at their house, every instance of neglect or cruelty, in case we needed evidence for a broader case. I left that meeting feeling lighter than I had in weeks, like maybe I wasn't crazy. Maybe I wasn't wrong to feel hurt and angry. Maybe there was a path forward that didn't end with me destroyed. That evening, something unexpected happened. Ethan came over for another family dinner, and this time he sought me out in the guest room before joining Mom and Dad. He knocked softly on the doorframe and asked if he could come in. I was so surprised I just nodded. He sat awkwardly on the edge of the twin bed, looking uncomfortable and unsure, and finally said, "Hey, Harper. I'm sorry about all this. About what happened to you." It was the first time he had acknowledged my accident, the first words he had spoken to me since before his graduation, and they were so inadequate that I almost laughed. "Thanks," I said, "because what else do you say? It's been really hard." Ethan shifted, not meeting my eyes. "Yeah, well, Mom and Dad said you're handling it though. They said you've always been the strong one, so you don't need as much help." And there it was, the narrative they had been feeding him, the justification for the neglect. I looked at my brother, this person I had grown up with but never really known, and decided to tell him the truth. "Ethan, I almost died. They didn't come to the hospital for 18 hours. I called and texted, and they ignored me because of your graduation party." His expression shifted from discomfort to confusion. "Wait, what? They told me you said not to come, that you didn't want to ruin my graduation day." I felt my anger flare hot and bright. "They lied to you." I was alone and terrified, and they chose champagne over being with me in the emergency room. Ethan looked genuinely shocked, and for a moment I thought maybe he could be an ally, maybe he could see through the lies and manipulation, but then he shook his head slowly. "I mean, they wouldn't lie about something like that. Maybe you just don't remember clearly because of the pain medication." The hope died as quickly as it had sparked. He couldn't see it. He was so deep in the golden child role, so conditioned to believe that everything revolved around him and his needs, that he couldn't accept the possibility that our parents had lied. "Ethan, they've been lying to both of us for years. Did you know I had a college fund from Grandma? $60,000 that was supposed to pay for my education? They transferred it all to you when you were 15. I watched his face carefully, looking for recognition or guilt, but all I saw was defensive confusion. "I don't know anything about that. Dad handles all the financial stuff." Before I could push further, Mom called from the dining room that dinner was ready. Ethan stood up, clearly relieved to escape the conversation, and then paused at the door. "Harper, I hope you feel better soon. But maybe you should try not to be so angry at Mom and Dad. They're just doing their best." Then he left, and I heard him join the family dinner that I once again hadn't been invited to. I sat alone in the guest room, feeling more isolated than ever, but something had shifted. I had tried to reach Ethan, had given him a chance to see the truth, and he had chosen willful blindness. I was done trying to fix relationships with people who refused to see me as worth the effort. Miranda moved faster than I expected. Within 3 days of our meeting, she had prepared and sent the legal letter via certified mail. I was in the guest room, attempting to do my physical therapy exercises, when I heard Dad's voice erupt from the front hallway. "What the hell is this?" The sound of footsteps pounding toward my room. And then Dad burst through the door without knocking, his face purple with rage, waving a sheaf of papers. "You're suing us? After everything we've done for you? This is how you repay us for taking you in." Mom appeared behind him, and her face was twisted with an ugly combination of shock and fury. "You ungrateful little bitch. We gave you a roof over your head when you had nowhere else to go, and this is how you thank us." I struggled to my feet, reaching for my crutches, trying to maintain some dignity even though my leg was screaming and my heart was pounding. "You stole my inheritance. You committed fraud. You abandoned me when I almost died. This isn't about gratitude. This is about accountability." Dad took a step closer, and Aunt Patricia had warned me this might happen, that cornered people often became aggressive. "That money was your grandmother's, and she would have wanted it used for the whole family, not just you. Ethan needed it more. He had more potential, more opportunities ahead of him. We made the right choice for the family." The casual admission of theft, said with such confidence, as if stealing $60,000 from your daughter was just good financial planning. "Grandma's will specifically left that money and the house to me," I said, my voice shaking but firm. "You forged documents to steal it. That's not a family decision. That's a crime." Mom tried a different approach then, and I had been expecting this too. Her face crumpled, tears appearing as if on cue, her voice taking on that wounded tone she used when she wanted sympathy. Harper, honey, we're your parents. We can work this out as a family. You don't need to involve lawyers and make everything so ugly in public. Think about what this will do to Ethan's reputation at his new job. Think about our standing in the community. Can't we handle this privately? The manipulation was so transparent it was almost laughable, but I knew it worked on other people. That Mom was skilled at playing the victim when it suited her. You had 18 hours to be my family when I was in the hospital, I said, and I was proud that my voice didn't break. You chose Ethan's party. You've chosen him every day of my life. I was never family to you. I was just the convenient child who demanded less and could be ignored. Dad's face went from purple to almost white, and then he said the words I had been both dreading and expecting. If you pursue this lawsuit, you're out of this family forever. We'll disown you completely. You'll have no one. I looked at him, this man who was supposed to protect me, and I felt nothing but emptiness where love should have been. I was never in this family. Not really. I had my phone in my pocket, and I had already texted Sloane and Aunt Patricia before the confrontation started. They arrived within 30 minutes, Sloane's car screeching into the driveway, both of them rushing into the house ready to defend me. Mom and Dad were still in the guest room, alternating between threats and tearful manipulation, but they fell silent when Patricia walked in with her phone held up, clearly recording. Say one more threatening word to her, and it'll add harassment to the list of charges, Patricia said, her voice cold as ice. Harper is leaving with us right now, and you're not going to stop her. We packed my belongings while my parents watched from the doorway, their expressions shifting between rage and something that might have been shame if they were capable of feeling it. I didn't have much, just some clothes and toiletries and my laptop. Everything else I owned was back at my apartment, and Sloane assured me we would get the rest later. As I hobbled out on my crutches, loaded down with a backpack, Mom made one last attempt. Harper, please. Don't do this. Don't tear this family apart over money. I stopped and turned to look at her. You tore this family apart the day you decided one child was worth everything and the other was worth nothing. Aunt Patricia's house was smaller than my parents' place, but it felt like a sanctuary. She set me up in her spare bedroom, which was filled with bookshelves, and had a comfortable queen bed and a reading chair by the window. You can stay here as long as you need, she said. No strings, no expectations, no throwing your recovery in your face. Your family, real family, and family takes care of each other. I cried then, deep sobbing tears that had nothing to do with pain medication or physical injury, and everything to do with finally feeling safe for the first time in weeks. Miranda moved into overdrive. She filed for an emergency restraining order based on the threatening behavior and the pattern of financial abuse, and to my surprise, a judge granted it within 48 hours. My parents were legally prohibited from contacting me or coming within 500 feet of me. She initiated the civil lawsuit to recover the stolen inheritance plus interest and damages. She reported the tax fraud to the IRS, triggering an audit of my parents' returns. She filed complaints with the state bar about the forged legal documents, which would require investigation. The legal machinery was in motion, and there was no stopping it now. The news spread through our extended family like wildfire, because these things always do in tight-knit communities. Mom and Dad immediately went on the offensive with their own narrative. According to the story they told anyone who would listen, I was mentally unstable from the accident and the pain medication, making false accusations because I was jealous of Ethan's success and bitter about having to recover at their house. Some relatives believed them, or at least pretended to, because it was easier than confronting the ugly truth. But Aunt Patricia wasn't having it. She posted in the extended family group chat, something I only learned about later because she had removed me from it to protect me from the vitriol. She posted screenshots of the hospital timeline showing exactly when the accident occurred and when my parents finally arrived. She posted photos I had taken of the fraudulent financial documents. She posted a written statement from Keisha, the nurse who had witnessed my parents' cruel behavior at the hospital and agreed to provide testimony. She posted everything, burning bridges with surgical precision, and she ended with a message that apparently shut down most of the defenders. If you choose to believe known liars and thieves over a young woman who almost died, that says everything about your character and nothing about hers. The family fractured along predictable lines. Some relatives, mostly on my mom's side, cut off contact with me entirely and doubled down on supporting my parents. Others, particularly the ones who had witnessed concerning behavior over the years, reached out to apologize for not speaking up sooner. A few tried to play peacemaker, sending messages about how this should be handled privately, as if massive fraud was just a family squabble that could be resolved over Sunday dinner. I didn't respond to any of them. I was done trying to make people understand, done exhausting myself trying to prove I was worthy of basic human decency. Ethan was caught in the middle, or so he claimed. He publicly defended our parents on social media, posting about how they were loving parents who had always done their best, how families sometimes disagree but love should prevail over conflict. The post was so naive and self-serving that I wanted to laugh. But then I received a private text from him asking if we could talk. Against my better judgment, and with Miranda's advice to document everything, I agreed to meet him at a neutral location, a public park where I felt safe and could leave easily if needed. He showed up looking uncomfortable, dressed in one of the expensive suits our parents had bought him, and we sat at a picnic table in awkward silence for a moment. Finally, Ethan said, "I didn't know about the hospital thing. Not the real version, and I didn't know about Grandma's money or the house." I wanted to believe him, wanted to think my brother was just an innocent bystander in all this, but I was too tired for delusions. "You never asked," I said. "You never questioned why you got everything and I got nothing. You never wondered why I was working 2 jobs through college while you partied on Mom and Dad's dime." Ethan got defensive, his face flushing. "I'm not the bad guy here. Mom and Dad made those choices. I was just a kid for most of it." He was right in a way, but also completely wrong. You're 23 years old now. You're not a kid anymore. And even if you didn't make the decisions, you benefited from every single one. That apartment you live in, the furniture, the car, the job connections Dad got you at Goldman Sachs through his college roommate, all of that was built on money and opportunities that were stolen from me. "So what do you want me to do?" Ethan asked, and he sounded genuinely frustrated. "Give everything back? Ruin my life because they messed up?" I looked at my younger brother, and I realized I didn't want anything from him. "I'm not asking you to ruin your life. I'm asking you to acknowledge the truth. To admit that our parents treated us completely differently and that difference wasn't fair or justified. That's it. Just acknowledgement." But he couldn't do it. He sat there struggling with the cognitive dissonance, trying to reconcile the loving parents he believed in with the evidence of their cruelty, and in the end, he chose comfort over truth. "I can't turn against them," Ethan said finally. "They're my parents. They love me." The unspoken end of that sentence hung in the air. "They love me, not you." "I know," I said quietly. "And that's why we can't have a relationship right now. Maybe someday you'll understand, but I can't wait for that day while you continue benefiting from their abuse." I left him sitting at that picnic table, and I didn't look back. There was grief in that choice, mourning for the brother I might have had in a different family, but also relief. I had given him a chance, and he had chosen his side. Now I could stop hoping for something that was never going to happen. 3 months after the accident, I was physically healing better than expected. I could walk short distances without crutches now, though I still needed them for longer outings, and the physical therapist said I had months of work ahead before full recovery. But while my body was mending, the legal battle was becoming more brutal than I had anticipated. My parents hired Caldwell Price, an expensive attorney who specialized in reputation management and making wealthy people's problems disappear. Their strategy became clear quickly. Paint Harper as mentally ill, addicted to pain medication, and motivated by jealousy and greed rather than justice. They filed a countersuit for defamation, claiming I had damaged their reputation in the community and caused Ethan emotional distress that was affecting his job performance. The allegations were absurd, but they forced Miranda to spend time and resources defending against baseless claims instead of just pursuing our case. The discovery phase began, where both sides had to turn over financial records and documentation, and what Miranda found was so much worse than we had initially known. My parents had been taking out credit cards in my name since I was 19 years old, using my social security number and forging my signature on applications. There were 7 different credit cards I had never known about, with a combined debt of approximately $35,000. They had been making minimum payments to avoid detection, but the interest had been compounding for years, destroying my credit score without me ever realizing why. I had always assumed my bad credit was from student loans and the difficulty of building credit as a young adult, but it was actually fraud. Identity theft on a massive scale, perpetrated by the people who were supposed to protect me. Miranda's face was grim when she showed me the evidence. "Harper, this moves it from civil fraud into felony territory. We're talking potential prison time for your parents." I sat in Miranda's office, staring at the spreadsheets, showing years of fraudulent transactions, and I felt numb. Part of me wanted to drop the whole thing, to run away from the ugliness of it all, but a stronger part of me knew that backing down now would mean letting them continue victimizing me forever. "What do we do?" I asked. Miranda leaned forward, her expression fierce. "We report it to the police. We file charges, we make sure they face real consequences, and we add this debt to the civil suit for recovery of damages." While we were building our case, my parents were waging their own war in the court of public opinion. Mom posted regularly on social media about the pain of being estranged from a daughter, about how adult children sometimes turn against their parents due to mental health issues and substance abuse. She never named me directly, but everyone knew who she was talking about. Dad gave an interview to the local newspaper about elder abuse, positioning himself and Mom as victims of a vindictive child trying to exploit them financially. They showed up at their church and told the congregation that I was on drugs and making false accusations, and several church members started calling and texting me with hostile messages. "You should be ashamed of yourself for treating your parents this way. Your mother is heartbroken, crying every day because of your lies. We're praying for your soul because you've clearly been led astray by Satan." The messages ranged from concerned to outright vicious. And even though I tried to ignore them, they accumulated in my phone like little poison darts. My parents even had the audacity to show up at Aunt Patricia's house one evening, pounding on the door and demanding to see me. Patricia called the police immediately, and officers arrived to enforce the restraining order. Watching my parents being escorted off the property by police, Mom crying dramatically and Dad shouting about his rights, should have felt like victory but mostly just felt sad. My mental health deteriorated under the constant assault. I started therapy with Dr. Lorraine Foster, a psychologist who specialized in family trauma and narcissistic abuse. Our first session, I spent the entire hour crying and apologizing for crying, convinced I was being dramatic and making mountains out of molehills. Dr. Foster listened patiently and then said something that changed my perspective. "Harper, you've been conditioned since childhood to believe you're worthless and Ethan is precious. That's not reality. That's systematic emotional abuse designed to make you accept mistreatment without complaint. Your parents are textbook narcissists, and Ethan is the golden child while you were assigned the scapegoat role. None of that is your fault, and all of your feelings are valid." The therapy helped, but it also made everything harder because I had to confront decades of buried pain and recognize patterns I had normalized. I started having nightmares about the accident mixed with childhood memories of being ignored and dismissed. I developed anxiety about checking my phone because it might contain more hate messages from people who believed my parents' lies. I struggled with intrusive thoughts telling me I should have just stayed quiet, should have accepted my lot in life, should have been grateful for the scraps I was given. Dr. Foster assured me these were normal responses to trauma, but normal didn't make them any easier to endure. Then came the second major betrayal, and this one cut deeper than anything my parents had done because it came from someone I had trusted completely. Sloan, my best friend and roommate, the person who had been my rock through the hospital stay and recovery, had been talking to Ethan behind my back. I discovered it accidentally when I borrowed her phone to look up directions while mine was charging, and I saw text messages from Ethan in her notifications. I opened the thread without thinking, driven by a sick feeling in my gut, and what I read made me feel like I was falling. Ethan had been telling Sloane that I needed to forgive our parents for my own healing, that holding on to anger was poisoning me, that family was more important than money or pride, and Sloane, well-meaning but completely misguided, had apparently agreed with him. The text showed weeks of conversation, with Sloane asking Ethan about how to help me move past this, and Ethan providing his skewed perspective on the situation. The most recent messages revealed that Sloane had organized a mediation without telling me, a plan to get me in a room with my parents so we could talk things out like adults. When Sloane invited me to dinner at her apartment that evening, I almost said no because I was exhausted from physical therapy. But she insisted it was important, that she had made my favorite meal, and like an idiot, I went. I struggled up the stairs to her third-floor apartment, knocked on the door, and when she opened it, I saw them. Mom, Dad, and Ethan, sitting on the couch in Sloane's living room. The ambush was so complete, so calculated, that for a moment I couldn't move. Sloane touched my arm and said gently, "Harper, I know you're angry with me right now, but you need to hear them out. Families need to work through things." I felt like I couldn't breathe, like the walls were closing in. My parents stood up, and Mom had clearly been coached on what to say because her tone was gentle and concerned, completely different from the fury she had displayed at their house. "Sweetheart, we're so worried about you. This lawyer has poisoned your mind against us. We love you so much, and we just want our daughter back. Can't we talk about this calmly?" It was a performance, a manipulation designed to make me look unreasonable if I reacted with anger. I turned to Sloane, and the betrayal was so sharp it felt physical. "You set me up. After everything I told you, after everything you witnessed, you sided with them." Sloane looked hurt, as if I was being unfair. "I'm not siding with anyone. I'm trying to help you heal. Harper, you can't keep living with all this anger and resentment. It's destroying you. Families should work things out, and sometimes that means compromise and forgiveness." "They're not my family," I said, and my voice came out louder than I intended. "They're my abusers. There's documented evidence of fraud, theft, and identity theft. This isn't a disagreement about who forgot to call on someone's birthday. They systematically exploited me for decades." Sloane shook her head, still not understanding. "But they're trying to make amends now. That should count for something." I looked at her, this person I had considered my closest friend, and realized she had never truly understood. She came from a loving family, and she couldn't conceive of parents who would deliberately harm their child. To her, all family conflict was resolvable through communication and compromise. "I'm leaving," I said, and I turned toward the door. Dad moved to block my path, and I saw Sloane's eyes widen as she realized this was escalating beyond what she had planned. "Harper, you're being childish," Dad said. "Sit down and let's discuss this like adults." I looked up at him, this man who had let me suffer for 3 days without pain medication, and something inside me broke free. "Get out of my way, or I'm calling the police and reporting a violation of the restraining order." He didn't move for a long moment, and I could see him calculating whether I would actually do it. Then Aunt Patricia called my phone, as if she sensed I was in trouble, and when I answered and told her where I was and what was happening, she said she was calling the police immediately. That broke the standoff. My parents left, Dad muttering threats about adding this to their countersuit, Mom crying about how I had become cruel and hateful. Ethan lingered for a moment, looking like he wanted to say something, but I just stared at him until he left too. Then I turned to Sloane, and I felt nothing but emptiness. "You betrayed me. You violated my trust in the worst possible way. I told you what they did, and you decided you knew better than me about my own trauma." Sloane was crying now, insisting she was only trying to help, that she thought I needed closure, that she was worried about me. I called a rideshare service and left without another word. The friendship was over, And unlike with my parents, where the end of the relationship felt inevitable, this loss actually hurt because I had believed Sloane was different. I had trusted her with my pain, and she had weaponized it to stage an ambush. Dr. Foster later helped me understand that people with healthy family backgrounds sometimes struggle to comprehend abuse dynamics, and Sloane's betrayal came from a place of ignorance rather than malice, but that didn't make it hurt less. I blocked her number, deleted her from my social media, and cut her out of my life completely. Aunt Patricia was furious when she picked me up from the coffee shop where I had waited after leaving Sloane's apartment. "I should have warned you to be careful about who you trust," she said. "People who've never experienced abuse often can't understand it, and they end up doing more harm than good by trying to force reconciliation." I was learning that lesson the hard way, discovering that my support system was smaller than I had thought but also more solid. The people who truly understood stayed, and the rest fell away, and maybe that was how it had to be. 6 months after the accident that had nearly killed me and definitely ended the last fragments of my family relationships, I sat in a courtroom waiting for a judge to decide my future. Miranda was beside me, calm and confident, with thick folders of evidence organized with color-coded tabs. Across the aisle, my parents sat with Caldwell Price, their expensive lawyer who had spent the past months trying to destroy my credibility and make this case disappear. The civil trial for fraud and recovery of stolen inheritance had finally arrived, and the criminal charges for identity theft were scheduled separately for the following month. I was terrified. Dr. Foster had coached me extensively on how to testify, how to stay calm under cross-examination, how to present facts without being overwhelmed by emotion. But theory was different from practice. And sitting there knowing I would have to face my parents in an official setting made my hands shake despite the beta blockers my doctor had prescribed for anxiety. Judge Murphy entered the courtroom, a stern woman in her 60s with silver hair and an expression that suggested she had seen every type of case and had no patience for nonsense. The bailiff called the court to order, and my civil case against Gregory and Diane Mitchell officially began. Miranda presented our case methodically over 2 days. She showed the forged documents that transferred my grandmother's trust fund to Ethan. She displayed the fraudulent sale of my grandmother's house and the routing of proceeds away from the intended beneficiary. She presented evidence of the credit cards opened in my name without my knowledge or consent. $35,000 of debt assigned to me through identity theft. She showed the tax returns where I had been falsely claimed as a dependent despite being financially independent, and the consequences this had for my access to assistance programs. She brought hospital records and witness testimony from nurses about the 18 hours I waited alone after a near-fatal accident. When it was time for me to testify, I walked to the witness stand on legs that felt like they might give out. I was sworn in, and then Miranda gently walked me through my testimony. I described growing up in a household where resources and love flowed exclusively toward my younger brother. I described discovering I had been robbed of my inheritance and watching that stolen money fund Ethan's privileged life. I described the accident, the fear, the desperate calls that went unanswered. I described the recovery at my parents' house, the neglect, the continued abuse even while I was injured and vulnerable. I kept my voice steady, stuck to facts, and tried not to cry even though every word felt like ripping open old wounds. Caldwell Price's cross-examination was brutal, exactly as Miranda had warned me it would be. He tried to paint me as a jealous sibling who couldn't accept that her brother was more successful. He questioned whether I had really been as injured as I claimed, implying I was exaggerating for sympathy. He suggested my pain medication use had made me paranoid and unreliable. He even tried to argue that my parents' financial decisions were made in good faith based on their assessment of which child needed support more. But Miranda had prepared me for all of it, and I had evidence that couldn't be dismissed by rhetoric and manipulation. "Isn't it true that you were jealous of your brother's success?" Caldwell asked, his tone suggesting this was a damning fact. I looked at him calmly and said, "No. I was hurt that my parents cared more about a graduation party than my life. There's a difference between jealousy and recognizing abuse." He tried another angle. Your parents provided food and shelter your entire childhood, didn't they? They fulfilled their legal obligations. I nodded. They provided the legal minimum required to not be arrested for neglect. But love and support aren't the same as avoiding criminal charges for child abandonment. Judge Murphy's expression had been neutral throughout most of the trial, but I noticed her jaw tighten when the hospital records were discussed, and her eyes narrowed when the forged documents were presented. When my parents took the stand to defend themselves, they stuck to their script about making difficult financial decisions for the good of the whole family, about me being oversensitive and ungrateful, about how they had always done their best. But Miranda dismantled their testimony piece by piece, showing contradictions and outright lies, and I could see the judge wasn't buying their performance. The verdict came 2 weeks later, long enough that I had convinced myself we would lose, that somehow my parents would escape consequences again. Aunt Patricia, Miranda, and I sat in the courtroom as Judge Murphy read her decision, and I barely breathed as she went through her findings. The judge ruled in my favor on every single count. My parents were ordered to return all stolen inheritance funds, which with interest over the years now totaled $82,000. They were ordered to pay my medical bills in full, $12,000. They were ordered to resolve all fraudulent credit card debt, $35,000, plus the cost of credit repair services. They were ordered to pay my legal fees, which had climbed to $48,000. The total judgment was over $177,000, and the judge ordered immediate payment. Judge Murphy also took the unusual step of making a statement before closing the case. I have presided over family disputes for 23 years, and rarely have I seen such calculated and systematic exploitation of a child by parents. The evidence presented in this case demonstrates a pattern of financial abuse, emotional neglect, and fraudulent behavior that cannot be excused by claims of making difficult parenting decisions. Miss Mitchell, I hope this judgment provides you with some measure of justice and the resources to rebuild your life, free from the people who should have protected you, but instead chose to harm you. I cried then, not from sadness but from relief and validation. A judge, someone with authority and power, had looked at all the evidence and confirmed that I wasn't crazy, wasn't oversensitive, wasn't wrong to feel hurt. The criminal case for identity theft was resolved through a plea deal a month later. My parents avoided jail time by agreeing to plead guilty, accepting 2 years of probation, 500 hours of community service, and full restitution. They would have criminal records for the rest of their lives, and Dad's professional reputation was permanently damaged. The scandal spread through their social circles, and many of the people who had defended them fell silent when faced with criminal convictions. Some relatives who had doubted me reached out to apologize, admitting they should have believed me from the start. Others doubled down, insisting the punishment was too harsh, and I should have handled everything privately. With the judgment money, I began rebuilding my life piece by piece. I paid off all medical debt. The weight of that financial burden lifting felt almost physical. I paid off my student loans, the loans I never should have needed because my education fund had been stolen. I put a down payment on a small one-bedroom condo in a quiet neighborhood, my first real home that belonged only to me. I started a freelance marketing business, working from home while I continued physical therapy and slowly regained full mobility. The metal rods in my leg would be permanent, a constant reminder of the accident, but the doctors said I would eventually have nearly full function back. 8 months after the accident, I finished my last physical therapy session. The therapist cheered as I walked across the room without limping, without crutches, just my own strength carrying me forward. It had been a long journey, painful in ways that went far beyond the physical. But I had made it to the other side. Emotionally, I was still healing, and probably would be for years, but I was stronger than I had been. Dr. Foster and I continued weekly therapy, working through the layers of trauma and building new patterns of thinking that didn't center around seeking approval from people who would never give it. 1 year after the accident, I received a letter forwarded through Miranda. Ethan had written to me, several pages of careful handwriting explaining that he was in therapy now, that he was starting to understand the unhealthy family dynamics, that he recognized he had been complicit in my mistreatment even if he hadn't orchestrated it. He apologized, not with excuses or justifications, but with what seemed like genuine remorse. He said he wasn't asking for forgiveness or a relationship, just wanted me to know that he saw the truth now and was working on being better. He included his therapist's contact information in case I ever wanted to do a mediated session together. I read the letter sitting in my condo, sunlight streaming through the windows I had picked out myself, in the home I had bought with money that was rightfully mine. I read it twice, looking for manipulation or hidden agenda, but it seemed sincere. I felt nothing. No anger, no joy, no hope, just a vast emptiness where my brother used to exist in my heart. Maybe someday I would respond. Maybe someday I would be willing to explore whether a relationship with Ethan was possible, but that day wasn't now and might never come. I put the letter in a drawer and decided not to decide, leaving the door neither open nor closed but simply unmarked. The hardest lesson I learned through all of this was that not everyone who hurts you will face consequences, and not everyone who says they love you actually knows what love means. But I also learned that I was stronger than I ever knew, that found family could be more valuable than blood relatives, and that choosing yourself isn't selfish when the alternative is accepting abuse. Aunt Patricia became more than just a relative. She became a true parent figure, someone I could call when I needed advice or just wanted to share good news. Miranda became a friend beyond just being my lawyer, occasionally meeting me for coffee to check in on how I was doing. I never heard from my parents directly after the judgment. They paid the money because they had no choice. But there was no apology, no attempt at reconciliation, no acknowledgement that they had been wrong. The restraining order remained in effect, and I renewed it every year without hesitation. Through the family grapevine, I heard they had moved to a smaller house, downsizing significantly to deal with the financial hit of the judgment. I heard Dad had retired early, his professional reputation too damaged to continue. I heard Mom had stopped attending her social clubs, unable to face the judgment of people who knew the truth. Part of me felt guilty for these consequences, the conditioning of a lifetime telling me I was responsible for their pain. But a larger part of me, the healthier part that was growing stronger every day, recognized that these were the natural consequences of their choices, not my fault. My business grew steadily over that first year, and I found satisfaction in building something that was entirely mine, success that nobody could attribute to anyone else's money or connections. I took on clients who appreciated my work, who paid fair rates, who treated me with professional respect. I made new friends through networking groups and hobby classes, carefully vetting people and slowly learning to trust again without immediately assuming everyone would betray me. I dated briefly and disastrously, discovering that childhood trauma had left me with attachment issues that would take time to unravel, but I wasn't in a rush. Healing wasn't linear, and that was okay. Sometimes I thought about that terrified woman in the hospital bed, desperately calling parents who never came, wondering what she did wrong to deserve such treatment. I wanted to go back and tell her that she didn't do anything wrong, that some people are broken in ways that make them incapable of loving certain people no matter how worthy those people are of love. I wanted to tell her that survival was possible, that life could be good on the other side of loss, that she was going to make it even when it felt impossible. But I couldn't go back. So instead I tried to be kind to my present self, to acknowledge the progress I had made, to celebrate the small victories that added up to a life worth living. The lessons I carried forward were hard-earned, but invaluable. I learned that blood doesn't make family. Love, respect, and showing up make family. I learned that some people will never see your worth, and that's not a reflection of you, but a reflection of them. I learned that walking away from people who hurt you isn't giving up. It's choosing yourself, and sometimes that's the bravest thing you can do. I learned that healing isn't about forgiveness, that you don't have to forgive people who aren't sorry, that you can let go of anger and move forward without absolving anyone of their actions. Most importantly, I learned that you can survive being unloved by the people who were supposed to love you most, and that survival can eventually transform into thriving if you give yourself permission to build a new life. One evening, almost exactly 1 year after the accident, I sat in my condo watching a webinar on trauma recovery. My phone buzzed with a text from Aunt Patricia, some silly meme about cats that made me laugh out loud. I had plans later that week to meet a potential client whose business I was excited about. My physical therapy was done, my leg fully healed except for occasional aches when it rained. My credit was slowly improving as the fraudulent accounts were removed from my record. I had a therapy appointment scheduled, a yoga class I had signed up for, a book club meeting at the library. I had a life, a real life, built on my own terms without anyone else's permission or approval. I closed the laptop and stood, stretching muscles that no longer screamed in protest. On my bookshelf sat a photo Aunt Patricia had taken of us at a pottery class we had done together, both of us laughing with clay-covered hands. Real family, chosen family, the family I deserved. I grabbed my keys, ready to head out to meet a friend for coffee, and I paused at the door to look back at my space. This condo, small but mine. This life, hard-won but genuine. This peace, fragile but growing stronger every day. I had survived, and more than that, I was beginning to thrive. So let me ask you, have you ever had to choose between blood family and your own well-being? Have you ever been the scapegoat in a family that had a golden child? Drop a comment and share your story, because you're not alone in this experience. If this story resonated with you, hit that like button and subscribe to this channel for more real-life stories about overcoming family trauma and finding strength you didn't know you had. Share this with someone who needs to hear that it's okay to walk away from toxic family members. Thank you for listening to my story and being part of this community of survivors and thrivers. Remember, your worth isn't determined by the people who couldn't see it. You deserve love, respect, and a life free from abuse. Stay strong, be kind to yourself, and know that better days are possible even when everything feels hopeless. Until next time, take care of yourselves and each other.